Welcome to Side by Side, a podcast where I, Robert Kuang, take you inside conversations with artists, creatives, healers, and warriors taking the charge in their transformational story. Today's guest is multidisciplinary writer, producer, and dramaturg Aisha Josiah from London. She's an award-winning playwright and screenwriter who has also written for publications such as Media Diversified, The Upcoming, and Mouthlondon. She has served as the editor of the independent theater blog Fringebiscuit since 2014. In this conversation, we dive inside Aisha's nomadic and multicultural upbringing, her passion for exploring postcolonial narratives, and the art of dramaturgy and criticism. You can find more side-by-side episodes at sidebysidepodcast.podbean.com. And if you're working on a purpose-driven writing project, I've opened up a few one-on-one coaching spots this season. You can learn more or book a discovery call at www.robertquanhome.com. You know, when we were at NYU, both of us, I don't know how much we had time to actually talk to each other and hold conversations, but I'm talking with Aisha today, and we were formerly classmates, but it was one of those things. You were in undergrad, I was in grad, and you were like a busy bee. So I think we just never crossed paths when we were at school, but I'm really thrilled that we're able to catch up now, years later. So Thank you for saying yes to this, Aisha.
Absolutely. And yeah, I feel the busy bee part has not changed. But yes, I do remember us bumping into each other occasionally and being like, oh, hey, you're really cool. And then invariably being like, oh, I've got 3 shows on, bye.
Yeah, I have to write 20 pages in 5
Right.
hours or whatever it is, right? Yeah, those were the days. But you're someone who's interesting because I moved from China to New York, and I'm now on the West Coast now. And you're someone who grew up traveling a lot. Is that correct?
Yes. So my parents moved around quite a bit when I was young. So I was actually born in New York. And then we moved over to the West Coast, to Washington for a little bit. And then when I was about 9 or so, we moved to London sort of permanently. I sort of grew up in London for the first half of my sort of childhood. When I guess, left secondary school, I went to NYU. I still call that my childhood, but I guess I was technically an adult. But
Yeah.
so I was an adult in name only.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
yeah, and so that kind of really had a great effect on the direction that my career went in and things. And then after I did my bachelor's at NYU, I went back to the UK to do a postgrad in Scotland. So I've always gone back and forth.
I was going to ask if you have any Scottish heritage, because there's a part of you that I see is I think allyship comes naturally to you in addition to just being your own advocate. So I can see how much your experiences have informed you in many ways in your work. How did traveling and seeing different parts of the world, which is, some people have that experience, some people don't. How do you think that actually influence the way you think about things that made you see things maybe a little differently sometimes from your peers?
Yeah, that's a great question. In terms of heritage, I do, on my mum's side, have Irish heritage. So,
Okay.
yeah, my mum's really into genealogy. And so we've worked our way back to Lydia Vaughan in Cork, which is really, really interesting to me. But in terms of traveling around, honestly, what I remember most about sort of when I was younger was really desperately wanting to fit in. And so, ironically, what happens is that I would try and take on the accent of wherever I was so that no one knew that I wasn't from there.
Mm-hmm.
And then at some point, I don't know what happened, some sort of Freaky Friday thing, where my accent would always be the wrong one for the place that we were in.
Yeah, I know, those things where you actually do hold multiple accents for some
Yeah,
people, and you can kind of switch, and that's people are like, what?
exactly. Yeah, and so I got to a point when I was a teenager where for some reason my accent would lag behind, and so it'd always
Hmm.
be one country too late. um, and so that was, for me, I was very much an introvert, and so that was actually quite challenging. And I went through a period when I was very quiet, not quite like officially mute, but I think I felt like I wasn't quite sure what accent would come out. And
Mm,
so it was just kind of like, oh, I feel really insecure about my voice. And now it's just something that I quite, love. And you have different voices when you're in, having different emotions, or when you're around different people. And when my family and I get together, we have a range of accents. We just sound like a sort of mini UN together. So we've been all over the place. Yeah, it's just I think in terms of how I write and how I approach art, it's been very useful to have a grounding in different traditions, and to sort of not be, I guess, not entirely sort of secure in this is how things are done. Because for me, it's
right.
always been like, oh, this is how things are done over here. There's never been like a set normal for me. I think that in terms of the way I think about ideas, it's always relational. It's always kind of, what is the set of circumstances that has led to this, knowing that these circumstances are all, arbitrary. They can be changed, and, you can have a completely different set of events happening. That's kind of how I think about characters. That's how I think about, like, dramatic situations.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, and I found that, I quite like that flexibility of thought. Yeah.
Yeah, I think for a lot of people who have grown up kind of moving around and just seeing a lot of different parts of the world, there's a certain way they engage with how they see, characteristics, behavior,
Hmm.
and the way that people make meaning inside of relationships. And just to go back to like, the accent thing, I
Hmm.
remember one of some of my earliest memories was just like, a lot of people think like my way or the highway, or like this is the way
Hmm.
it's done, this is the way it's not done. But if you traverse across multiple cultures, like I cannot tell you how many times it was like totally fine in one circumstance and another one is like, oh, you're being rude right now, like slurping food. And I was like, that's a compliment where I'm from,
Yes.
and et cetera, et cetera. And just like things you were not intending to do and you just didn't understand the context. I think those moments really informed a lot of, yeah, probably a lot of why I wanted to write, to kind of like
Hmm.
bring up these things of like, oh yeah, this is kind of uncomfortable. And like, I don't think anyone else picked up on it and things like that, right? So I always was like, perspectives are always changing rather than being that rigidity in my
Yes.
upbringing.
It's so funny, I think, particularly in this like political climate where you have people who sort of seem nostalgic for like a certain type of past, or, this is how things used to be. And I find that line of thinking so interesting because, as someone who's traveled around, I've never had a sense that this place belonged to me, and I was sort of guaranteed for it to like and feel a certain way. So that's an interesting thought. That's kind of like, wow, you really feel like this place is yours. But I think also, as a visitor to a place, you are so aware of what makes it unique in a way that I think,
Right.
yeah, many people sort of overlook. So I know when I first went to London, you would hear a lot of people say, well, I mean, English people don't have like culture. And I'm like, what are you talking about? Like,
Hmm.
I can recognize like this is a person from England, like immediately in a conversation,
Right.
because there are so many
Right. Right.
different things that identify you. And but when at school we would have these sort of like cultural days where everyone's coming in with their like special clothes and stuff. And
Mm,
people would say, I just have a football kit. We don't have anything. And you're like, no, you don't see it because you're in it. you know
right.
but
Right.
if you're not in it, then of course you see it. It's there. It's just as beautiful as the next one. But I find that something. I see that in the States a lot as well. Where it's kind of like what it means to be American is litigated, and there's this.
Over and over again.
Yeah, exactly. And there's this idea that like the norm is kind of an absence of something, you know?
Yeah.
And that's completely just bizarre to me.
Right.
So it's so rich and full of its own thing.
I've also heard that London and New York share
Hmm.
similarities, or like if people have gone to both, there are similar vibes, like the things that make them kind of challenging for people, but also kind of the big city opportunity vibe,
Yeah.
surrounded by people who are trying to find opportunity. Do you find that to be true?
I think London and New York are very similar in different ways. I would say New York definitely has more of a audacious, ambitious kind of atmosphere to it. I think I feel it as soon as I, come off the plane. Everyone's hustling. Everyone's like,
Because everyone's stressed.
yeah, everyone's stressed. I remember I once told an ex-partner of mine, like, we were visiting New York for the first time, and I said, three things will happen without fail, and I can't, like, I don't know why, but this is what will happen. You will smell something very bad. What it is, we don't know. We don't care to know. You will hear someone curse for no apparent reason very close to you. And something will be on fire again. I don't know why. It will be on fire. It will just be on fire. And we touched down at JFK, and within like 5 minutes of leaving the airport, all three had been like had come true. And I was like, yeah, I like that. I know this city well enough that, it feels like, yep, we're back.
Yeah.
But I think part of that sort of chaotic energy is what makes it such a lovely crucible for work. Because there isn't this sort of downtime. There's always something to wrestle with. And it can be overwhelming. I'm based in Edinburgh now, partly because I like having the option of opting out of that sort of 24/7 culture, because I immerse myself in it so much that eventually I have to sort of like parent myself and be like, you know what, I think you're tired and you're exhausted and you need to leave and go and see trees and things. Go and look at water or something,
Time to go look at the moors or go upstate New York or something.
Because otherwise the brain doesn't switch off, and it's sort of a double-edged sword in that sense. I love it, but for my own well-being, I think those periods of absence are necessary. In terms of London, I would say a big difference for me is that what we would consider, I think, in New York, sometimes I think it feels like it's considered sort of like high culture in a way that is a little uncomfortable for me. Things like going to the theatre, going to the museums, having intellectual sort of conversations and stuff.
That's seen as more like everyday.
Exactly. A lot more grounded, like it's not going to a gallery is not just for a date. You know what I mean? Going to a gallery is like, because you actually want to go and see what's going on, and you keep up with it and stuff. And not in a way that's kind of like, I'm going to tell everyone else that I'm doing this too, but just, because it's infused. I would say Paris is even more so.
Okay.
Yeah, Paris is even more in that direction. But London, I think, one of the things that I cherish about it is that theatre, for example, still feels very accessible. We are moving towards the Broadway model of ridiculous ticket prices and stuff, but this is something new for London, and hopefully something that doesn't take off too well. I think that is something that they share in a way, but I think in some ways I feel like American culture and New York culture can feel a little stratified, when people do this, when people do that.
People are sorted,
yes,
right?
Yes.
Yeah. I can totally see that, and I've also heard from other artists who've particularly worked in Europe, throughout Europe. They're like, oh, the arts and culture scene is seen and perceived very differently. It's a lot more normal. It's a lot more like part of the everyday comfort for communities, in a way that here it's like a little more specialized, or like, I don't know, it's like it's for artists to go, and I'm like, no, anyone can go. I think it's the same sort of feeling of people still dressing up to go out to Broadway, and my real goal, I think, if I was a theater god or something, would be like, you can go to Broadway in your PJs, like, right.
This is a conversation. And in fact, like, I don't want the tickets to be, $500, because I want you to come and see this show like 5 or 6 times so that you can really have a conversation with it.
Right.
Do you agree with it? Do you disagree? One of my absolute fantasies would be like, we go back to like the 1800s or something, and if you don't like it, you tear up the seats, and like, shame on you.
Bring back like grunge theater.
How dare you suggest that Nora might leave her husband? Like, let me just go and destroy this theater a little bit because I'm so outraged. you know,
Really get the immersed audience
right. I mean, at least
experience.
you know they've been listening, you know?
You know what? We struggle with so much disengagement, but partially it's kind of like, the way we think of sharing art and offering it as
Mhm.
well. I think that's very much true. And, you're a writer, artist, a producer, editor, dramaturg. Do you remember when you first started writing?
Oh, that's a great question. So I kind of, because I actually started off figure skating. I started figure skating when I was about 5, and so that was my first love, and I kept that up until I was about 17. And when I stopped figure skating, because I made a conscious choice, I was getting to the time of like applying for universities, and I
Hmm.
sort of really sort of sat myself down and was like, well, you could sort of pursue this thing, but there, to my mind, there were so many potential pitfalls. You break your leg, you're out for a season, you have a career-ending injury. At the time, I was part of a synchronized skating team, and so yeah, it
Oh,
was very extensive scheduling, and you're going all around
yeah.
Europe and stuff. Loved it, but also there's no time to sort of engage in like going to university and things like that. That's something that you have to choose one or the other. And so I said, like, well, I think I want to go to uni. I think I want to have a, not quite a backup plan, but just feel like I'm skilled in other things. When that sort of like decision was made, I realized I don't know what I do outside of figure skating. Like, what do I do? And so I started writing, doing a bit of writing. And I also got into just taking on different internships.
Yeah.
I had discovered I was quite the annoying rebel in that I rebelled at school, but I also like made sure I had good grades. So it was like I don't want to go to class, but also I will pass this test because I feel like it's kind of important.
He said, I don't always accept authority, but not because I'm dumb.
Yes,
I am very smart.
exactly. And so I was like the absolute worst person because they're like, what, if you don't go to class, this is what will happen. I was like, well, I don't know if that's true because I seem to be doing fine, actually, not going to the class. But
Oh my
and
gosh.
so when I cut class, when I would sort of just go and do my own thing, I was going to do like internships at like the BBC and stuff. Like it really was like the sort of worst kind of like rebelliousness.
That's such a distinct
Yeah,
personality.
I was like, I can't go to class today because I'm actually, doing, interviews for internships actually. So, I think that that's just more important.
During that time, you had already kind of like stopped focusing on synchronized skating,
Yeah,
or?
yeah. So to put in perspective, for the best part of like 10 years or so, I would wake up at 4 a.m., go, skating, go to school, go skating, do my homework, go to sleep kind of thing. And that was, it's a full-time job, even though it's a hobby.
Yeah.
Yeah. And, competing in that sort of environment, you kind of need to do that. But
Yeah.
once you decide you're not competing, I mean, that's like a good 30, 40 hour chunk of the week that's like been opened up to you. And so I just found myself really just at a loss. Like, what do you do with all this time? And it was quite difficult, to be honest.
Hmm.
You just sort of like, I felt very lost. And so I think I just countered that eventually with jumping into things and just saying yes to different opportunities. And so that got me into film and TV. That got me into theatre. I ended up joining the Young Friends of the Almeida, which was a lovely theatre group that had internships for writing and directing and
Hmm.
things.
Hmm.
And it was associated with the Almeida Theatre that was run by Michael Attenborough at the time. He was just lovely. David Attenborough's brother, I believe. Brother or
Okay.
yeah,
I was like, wait.
yes, of the Attenboroughs. Yeah, I think brother or uncle. I can't
I was
remember.
like, that Attenborough?
Yes, exactly. And so just really, really like great program. And
Yeah.
it was at a time when there was a lot of funding. There was a Labour government, and they were really investing in communities and stuff. So we had things like summer university and stuff. It was lovely. And through that, I was able to sort of get my first look at the Edinburgh Fringe. I went up as a sort of a production assistant. and I got my internships, Channel 4 and the BBC, and that introduced me to screenwriting, and then that enabled me to sort of write a script that got picked up for oh my gosh, what was it? The North London Film Fund Award, and that eventually got me into NYU. So it was just
Oh my
yeah,
gosh.
it was
Yeah.
kind of one of these things that was very roundabout. Um, and the irony is that both of my parents had gone to and worked at NYU in various capacities, and they always joke that it would have been much cheaper if I'd like just made it known that I wanted to go to NYU, because then they could have like just kept some sort of connection there or something.
Are your parents like academic types?
Not really. My mom's a teacher, and my
Yeah.
dad works for the Met Police. And
Okay.
so yeah, it's just to be fair, my mom's parents are both artists.
Yeah.
And they, so there's that kind of history there. My dad's side, I would say they're more sort of entrepreneurs, like owned a
Yeah.
bakery, and my dad is originally from Antigua. So yeah, his family sort of moved half to London and half to New York.
Okay,
Yeah,
so that's how that happened, and you
exactly.
have like
Yeah,
roots and okay.
yeah,
I mean, to say it was an interesting life would be an understatement, but a lot of it was just also out of your own like internal
yes.
engine, you know?
Exactly. I think if there's anything that I've gotten, I think in hindsight, I see that I've gotten from my parents is just a sort of sense of like quiet adventure, because they were
Yeah.
both quite young when they decided to, make these huge moves, and I'm sure they didn't have a plan, and so I kind of like making big decisions, not in a sort of reckless way necessarily, but in a sort of way that, you have a lot of faith in yourself, and you say, I'm sure that I will be able to manage whatever difficulties come along with this decision.
Hmm.
So let's go and do it and see what happens. And that's,
Yeah.
yeah, kind of, what I like to do, just be bold about it.
Yeah, be bold about making a decision.
Exactly. Yeah.
Which, honestly, it's very human for people to try to avoid making these big decisions where there might
Absolutely.
be consequences, but on the other side of it also takes, the courage it took
Yes,
that ultimately got you to New York and all these opportunities. Every one
exactly.
of them was sort of like a choice that you had to make with a little bit of courage,
Yeah.
right? So,
Yeah. It's funny you say that, because I remember shortly before coming to NYU for undergrad, I was speaking with a friend who had recently gotten into I think Cambridge or something for physics. And he sort of said, okay, but like what's your plan B? Like if it doesn't work out. And it really had not occurred to me that a plan B was like a thing. And so I was kind of like, oh, well, I don't know. I mean, this is the plan as much as it, I mean, I guess if it doesn't work out, I'll just do something completely different. I don't know. Like,
go back to synchronized skating.
yeah, like it just didn't occur to me. I was like, I'll do it until, I've run it to its course. And, and generally
Yeah,
for me, that just means I'm tired of it. I don't want to do it anymore. Um,
right, right.
but it never occurred to me, like, you get to a point of like, this has failed. I need to have a backup plan.
And you don't seem like the person to like suffer through it either. I mean,
Oh,
you do it because you still it's enjoyable to kind of like commit to something and
yes.
like go all in.
Yeah,
Not for everyone, but I think that there's like an artistic spirit of like,
of
oh, I
course.
have to fight for this thing. You know what I
Yeah.
mean?
I mean, the way I interpret it is like I call it a type of delusion. Like I think I'm slightly
Yeah.
delusional, which
Oh,
I'm
me too.
happy to be. Like I think if that is what means that I can make decisions that are irrational to like the bystander looking in, but make complete sense to me, then that's okay. And I think the people that I admire most in this industry and just generally are ones for whom they are, what's it, they are the measure of their own success, they are the measure of their
Hmm.
own happiness. They operate outside of social norms and contexts and stuff. It doesn't mean sort of like a solipsistic kind of existence. I don't think like let's just ignore everyone else on the planet. But I think that running after a type of success is so draining and unfulfilling. And at the end of it, you sort of, what do you have? It feels like something that can always be taken away. But when you are sort of feeling like you are exactly where you should be, doing the thing that's completely fulfilling to you in this moment. There's something so nice about not feeling like you like, what more would I want? I don't want
Mm-hmm.
anything else. I'm doing the thing, you know?
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
And so I just try and go from moment to moment like that. Um, you know,
Yeah.
it's
Yeah.
just I just what more could I want from that, you know? Maybe I find it easy to do that though, because like I'm the delusion is like I'm just very optimistic and probably like about my ideas. I'm like, yeah, what could go wrong? Let me just go and check out this volcano, and you're like, oh, many things could go wrong.
Oh, that's so
Yeah, I
funny.
mean, it's just
Where you're
so
like, well,
easy.
sometimes you're like, I check in with people and they're like, are you sure?
Yeah,
No.
yeah, like okay. I frequently I've just got on trips and like, you know, my mom will be like, where are you staying? I'm like, I don't know yet. She says as she gets on the plane. And you're like,
Right. Right.
okay. Well,
I get it.
figure it
Yeah, I
out.
see that. I see that for you. And you also do like your focus, and I think like your personal mission
Mhm.
is very clear for anybody, but you also kind of can do different types of roles depending on the
Yeah.
project, right? And one thing you do talk about is dramaturgy.
Mhm.
And I've been sadly I was once like a dramaturgical not hater per se, but I was like, what is it?
Yeah.
Right? And over the past like 10 years or so, we've seen so many films and projects where it just feels like the production itself is entirely transactional and
Right.
the end result doesn't quite make much sense.
Yeah.
So there comes a moment where I was like, oh yeah, there was no dramaturgical support
Mhm.
or any sort of care that goes into actually wrapping together everybody's work
Yeah.
in a cohesive way. So I was wondering if you could talk about what dramaturgy is, what that can look like inside of like a collaboration or a project, and just like your personal experience with it.
Oh, of course. I mean, dramaturgy is such an interesting, still kind of nebulous thing, and maybe that's always a part of it. I remember when I, you know, started my course in dramaturgy at Glasgow University. Really, you know, it felt like the first semester was large. Like, what is dramaturgy? What is a dramaturg? You know, honestly, it never really felt like there was a definitive answer. You know, no matter how many textbooks you went through, and like, you know, you sort of like start with the handbook of dramaturgy, the history of dramaturgy, and you know the sort of German underpinnings of it, and everything sort of kind of makes sense, but it doesn't really give you a full answer. And what I enjoyed about studying it in an academic setting was that it was without the pressures of creating work to a certain time scale. So you really had the indulgence of sort of thinking about abstract concepts of storytelling and what does that mean. When I got out into the real world and I'm like, okay, how do I call myself a dramaturg? Then that's kind of when I felt like I have to define it for myself. And for me, I really consider it a process of understanding what an artist is attempting to achieve. You know,
Mm,
what's in the brain, and how do we get as close to that in real life. And so for me, questions of like, is this good, or is this, you know, is it the right way to do it, are kind of irrelevant, because this is the idea, right?
hmm.
And if you are able to fully articulate that idea, then it is not whether or not it's good, it's whether or not it's accurate. I think often, for example, if someone said, like, I'm writing a comedy, right? And then they
Hmm.
give you, you know, here are the blocks that I'm working with, you know, here's the character, here's the, you know, the plot and whatever. Well, then my questions are like, it's a comedy, is it funny? In what way is it funny? Is it funny in the way that you want it to be funny? What do you want to elicit from the audience? And so
Hmm.
depending on what the answer to that is, that determines how we work with it. You know, so everything's very unique. And that's why for me it kind of makes it irrelevant, because you know, your project kind of has nothing to do with a comparable one. It's
Mm.
interesting to have comparisons, and I do work, you know, with references. Like, just I'm known for giving, like, you know, here's 10,000 pages of references, but those are interesting because they help you articulate what your thing is and what it is not. You
Right,
know,
right.
not because I think that you should emulate it because this is the gold standard. you know.
Yeah.
And
It gives you more to like contextualize what it is you're
exactly,
working on, right?
exactly.
Yeah.
And so
Hmm.
that's, I think, what I find so compelling about dramaturgy and so delicious is that process of it, I think, is very empowering because it's all about explain to me again what it is you mean and go even deeper and go even, and why do you think that, you know? And it's without judgment. It's just this kind of trying to get it to a concrete place where at some point you feel like, oh, I understand. And that feeling of understanding between two people can be so, weighty and just comforting. And
Yeah.
yeah, it's sort of a beautiful process. And then when you see that go on the stage, it's amazing.
And a lot of it would be like things that people may not be able to see right away, but
Hmm.
they always add to the overall picture. Like an example of this, which is, in the TV world, not theater, but I've been watching like White Lotus
Oh,
lately, and
yeah.
there's been so much discussion about the costume, all of the accessories they wear, the color schemes,
Hmm.
the literary references that they're calling to with the paintings and the
Hmm.
artwork and everything. And all of that ultimately is related to a bunch of different production
Yeah.
departments, but there's like a dramaturgical through line that
Yes.
you can tell is very intentional,
Yeah.
right? Versus something where you're like, why is there a zipper on that period dress? And things like it's just like random things that just wind up throwing you off that maybe didn't need to be there.
Yeah, and it just throws questions there. I mean, it's kind of like it's funny to sort of like I think about things with a dramaturg's hat on, and then people will often sort of like ask me to put on like a critic's hat on as well because I do theatre criticism,
Mm-hmm.
and they are different hats. Don't get me wrong, but I think one being a dramaturg has definitely made me a more nuanced theatre critic, nuanced and empathetic. I mean, I would say that the conversations about how effective something is or what are the implications of it are far more interesting than whether I liked it or not. I like chocolate ice cream as well, like should we all eat chocolate ice
Right.
cream? Like, that's
Right.
irrelevant, to the conversation. But the sort of implications of, how can you have this sort of epic drama that also feels incredibly contemporary, that also works as an anthology? I mean, White Lotus, I think, does so much that is visually stunning, but also feels like this mishmash of high and low culture, which feels
Yeah.
very, very relevant today, where we have so many different influences happening at the same time. And so, yeah, I agree with you. I love how cohesive it feels as an idea.
And I think that's really the thing that sometimes when people are watching movies where they're like, there's a overall discussion of like what happened to the quality, or like
Hmm.
studios are their projects are they just feel different,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
I think a lot of it is just cohesion.
Hmm.
When hundreds of people try to work together, sometimes it can be really challenging. If you're
Yeah.
not careful, a project can wind up being sometimes a disaster. I mean, you don't want that to be a case,
Hmm.
but yeah. And also, by the way, I also think inside of writers groups, we're kind of basically trying to offer each other dramaturgical support.
Absolutely.
You know what I mean?
Yes.
Because we need it. We don't have other spaces too often to actually care about these things.
Yeah, I mean that's one of the things. I mean, and I struggle with this because I every so often people are like you need to have more of a business minded approach to this. But I started doing dramaturgy like very very cheaply for my friends, and then sort of expanded from there. And I've always thought, just as someone who never grew up as a theatre person and knows like any hurdle can put off someone entirely. So if you are someone who's written your first play or something like that, and you're like, what do I do with it now? A dramaturg, can be a really great introduction to the world. And so I still, I have the same rates that I started with. And like routinely I now have to put something in like emails where I'm like, yes, this is not a typo. Because I frequently have people come back and say, I'm sorry, I think you wrote. And I was like, no, I did. And so what I love about it though is that it makes it feel as essential as I think it is. I think somewhere along the line, Western theatre in particular got to this place of like individualism where the artist is supposed to sit in a room and do something amazing, just create a masterpiece on their own and then reveal it to the world. And the world goes, oh my God, look at that genius,
And it's usually built on like huge amounts of impulse
Mhm.
and kind of rallying at the last minute. And I know that as a creative,
Mhm.
but you don't always know what you're going to get. And
Exactly.
dramaturgy is like, let's really think about what we're putting together.
Yeah. And my thing is like there's nothing wrong with acknowledging the collaborative nature of what it is that you're doing. You're in conversation with ideas, hopefully, that came from outside of yourself. I don't think there's any way that you could not be in conversation with ideas that, came outside of you. And so there's nothing wrong and there's nothing that, takes away from your perspective by sort of saying, you know what, I sat down with someone and we just went back and forth and really wrestled with this to sort of figure out what do I mean. And I think, back in the 1700s, 1800s, when we were much more of a letter writing culture, that's kind of what we did, and that's what people admire about, old letters. I'm articulating myself to you and you're articulating yourself back to me, and we're doing it in such a way that it's a contained piece. It's a full thought. Your articulator, if you're having a good, your interlocutor, if I should say, if you're having a good conversation, will come back with some questions about this, and let me test the logic of what you're saying, and let me respond to this. And
Hmm.
that's kind of, I think, what dramaturgy is. I think it's a real conversation.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
there's also an intentional like safe environment being created to
Yes.
test out the work. And once you send it out, for better or worse, there's some things you have to accept, right? Like,
Yeah.
if people see it, we can't control what people say,
Mhm.
but there are kind of ways along the way to kind of somewhat prep or help you prepare
Yeah,
for when you send your baby out into the world, so to speak,
of
right?
course.
But anyway, I just wanted to talk about
Mhm.
that because even personally, as a writer, I'm just like, wow, we are really missing this particular element
Yes.
based on what I'm seeing lately.
Yes.
So,
And I think also it's a sense of empowerment for the artist as well, because I think we have given up a lot of our power in over to people who are in charge of distribution, not creation.
yeah,
And distributors are important, but I think it's also important for the writer or the artist generally to know that that is entirely separate from the act of creating the work. You thinking about a target demographic, thinking about, is this going to play well on this, stage or whatever. They're not, silly throwaway questions. They do become relevant at a certain point, but I don't think that they should have any bearing on what you decide to create.
right,
No.
right,
And I
right.
see that a lot. Like, I have this idea, but no one will want to see it because where's the market for it? And you're like, what does that
Hmm.
mean? What are you doing?
And if there was a market, what does that mean,
Yeah,
right? Does
exactly.
that change anything?
Right. It's like, oh,
you
this
know?
must be a good idea because there's a market for it. It's like, well, there's a market for like eating Tide Pods. So, like,
Right, exactly.
like higher.
I know. Sadly, there are many niches online if you look for them.
Yeah,
But
yeah,
what is that relevant to the work that you're trying to
exactly,
create?
exactly.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
for sure. You also talk about, in addition to being a writer, dramaturg, you've kind of been in the role of like editor
Hmm.
or kind of like editor in chief, having to make leadership executive decisions and also being a critic
Yeah.
at times. And for me, as a part of my like freelance writing world, I do that on occasion,
Hmm.
but it is like I'm suddenly in a different dynamic in relationship to the writers and artists that I'm usually
Hmm.
there with.
Yeah.
How have you navigated those times when at least for me, I've had to process and perhaps at times get over my own discomfort
Mm.
with being in a particular position that has different like expectations now
Yeah.
and implications?
Yeah, I think that's such a great question. And I think, honestly, being as open as possible, what I found, every year I go to the Fringe, and definitely going as a critic, people treat you very differently. And I find that it was important for me to be able to explain that I am not a teacher grading your test, I have
Right.
no
It's not like an
interest in that.
assessment.
Yeah.
Right.
And I think for a lot of people, and for good reason, and I don't exclude myself from this at all, but for many people, the work is a proxy for yourself. And so to have the work rejected does feel like you're being rejected in some way. It's so important to resist that understanding of the work, because of course it isn't, and also, who would I be to reject someone that I don't know? And so for me, I think part of theatre criticism is it's a process of educating as well, to sort of say, think about what this is. This is a conversation between people, and this is a conversation between the critic and the creator. It's funny. I recently met one of my all-time like heroes, Mark Fisher, who's a very
Mhm.
famous critic, and he came out with like the definitive book, I think, on theatre criticism, which I used in my criticism classes. And so I met him at a party, and I was like, oh my god, on the inside.
Yeah.
I think I might have done it on the outside as well. But it was just a beautiful thing. But one thing that he sort of focuses on is this kind of tripart methodology of trying to understand, like, what is the thing, what is the purpose, like what is the intention of the artist, and how close to that intention have they gotten,
Mhm.
and
Mhm.
that's such a different framework than going in and sort of saying like, oh, this was good, or this wasn't as good as the other thing,
Right. Right.
because it, were they trying to achieve the same thing? You know, if they weren't, then that's kind of comparing apples to oranges. And
Yeah.
so
Interesting.
yeah, that's the kind of conversation that I like to have with creatives, and I think it puts criticism into a very different position than we're used to seeing it. I always think of like Birdman, the theater critic being this like animal that is just there to sort of like tear you down, and the game is to sort of like sidestep them and woo them and do something, and it's an adversarial relationship, and I don't believe that criticism needs to be that.
For
Yeah.
sure. I think there's like an old school way of looking at critics of you make yourself known by standing out with what you write.
Hmm.
And sometimes in like people are reading to see what insults they're throwing,
Yeah.
right? And things like that.
Yeah.
But then there's, being a reviewer and critic where the intention hopefully is to add to the overall conversation of the
Exactly.
project and what it's trying to achieve, and perhaps even through like your reflections and observations, again, that it's additive and
Yeah.
not something that takes away gas in the tank for the artist
Yeah.
and for the project itself. But it's interesting because there were times where I was recently assigned to review something and it's been a long time, and sitting in the audience I was sort of like, sometimes I was like, oh, what feedback should I give and things like that. I was like, no, that's not really my role here. I'm
Mhm.
both an audience and also just thinking about the messaging a
Yeah.
little bit there.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was interesting because I noticed people were talking to people, knew who their critics were, and
Hmm.
everyone else knew everyone else, and I was
Yeah.
like submerged in that world, trying not to just trying to be neutral.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing, especially when people know the role that you're there for, because you do sort of feel put on the spot. Like I definitely have been to shows that have been performed very conspicuously to me, and it's kind of like,
Oh my
yeah,
goodness, oh, that's
looking me
awkward.
dead in the eye, And I'm like,
You're like, yes.
yeah,
Okay.
is this part of the show because it's deeply uncomfortable? Is that what you're going for?
Right,
But
right.
I think it's an interesting position. What I try to sort of remember is that we sort of think of like culture as like these artifacts, like plays and things like that. But the culture is actually the conversation around these artifacts, right? It's how we contextualize them. So this act of criticism is culture making, right? I put some new thoughts in, the ether about this show or performance that I've seen, and I'm encouraging you to come back to me at that. And in that conversation that we have, this is the culture. This is what the community thinks about this thing. And if we think about this thing, what are the implications? What do we think on a broader level? Um, and so I think that's a very important role. And so that's why I think criticism is essential. But I also think because it's so important, we need to be better at educating people in how to do it, and also what it actually functions, what's the function of it, what's it there for. And in particular, I think artists should be on the front lines of that, because I think artists, people who are deeply immersed in the creation of work, are the most empathetic, nuanced critics that I've ever come across, but
Mm.
often need a lot of encouragement. I've had to encourage, people who say I'm an actor or I'm a lighting designer. I don't know criticism,
Oh,
and
interesting.
you
I
sort of go,
see.
what do you
Yeah.
mean you don't know? You if anyone knows theatre, you know theatre.
Yeah, I would love to hear a lighting designer talk about lighting
Yeah,
on a show,
in a concrete
actually.
way, because they illuminate, pun intended. Like they really just get you like a completely different perspective. I could be thinking about it all day. What if you had these different lighting states, and in this particular show, what would that mean? I want us as a community to become well versed in these different areas, because I think it can only help the quality of the work that we create.
Yeah.
Yeah, we're well versed in celebrity and marketing. I think we've had enough. We are all very deeply immersed in that, and we understand, and we've got all of the satire and stuff around it. But what does it mean to sort of think about it from a musical perspective, or to think about it from
Yeah.
a director's perspective? How can we deepen those conversations? And I think that's what criticism is great for. And that's why I think we need lots of different types of critics, coming from lots of different
Mm.
backgrounds. Um,
There you
yeah,
go. Yeah.
exactly. They can't all be.
That may be another element to all of this as well, is
Yeah,
like what is a particular landscape like when there's just a lot of different ways of looking at
exactly.
criticism.
And
Yeah, yeah.
people who like, just go to the theater. Like I came from the gym, now I'm going to the theater, or like I came from Wall Street, now I'm going to the theater. Like it just, that's what we need, I think. Really to just have an actual real slice of what this culture is.
We have a little bit of time left, and I wanted to ask you about your experience as a Black woman.
Hmm.
So, since you started writing and creating and committing to being an artist in all the ways that you are, how do you think the landscape has changed,
Hmm.
let's say the arts and entertainment industry, but also particularly, let's say, for BIPOC women like
Mm,
yourself?
that's really interesting. I think something that I've thought about recently is that from a writing perspective, I actually had to go through a process, and I think I'm still going through this process of actually distinguishing what is me and what is the culture that I've been socialized in. I realized a little while ago that when I was introduced to theater and the plays and stuff that really lit my brain on fire, this was stuff like Sam Shepard, David Mamet, Oscar Wilde, right? And honestly, for all intents and purposes, I was a playwright who was a white man, because those are the stories
Mm,
that I grew up with. Those are the ones that resonated with me.
yeah.
And so then when I'm, started taking on like, Lynn Nottage and Susan Laurie Parks, and, different, and I traveled also to Ghana and to Paris and, different places, and, experienced different theater traditions. That's when I kind of had my first kind of breaking out of that, this idea of the canon, and this is what literature is. And I think it's really important to sort of, to understand that, I think, about quote unquote minority writers, because many of us in a post colonial society are speaking fluently in a language that is not ours. And so, what is the language of people who have been subsumed in another culture? It's something different. It's a kind of patois. It's a kind of, it's beautiful and it's there, but it's almost like it needs like an anthropologist to sort of like get in there and figure out
Hmm.
what it is that this is.
Yeah.
I think a challenge when it comes to the day-to-day logistics of being a black female playwright is how you present yourself, because there is the expectation I think part of the challenge is how you present yourself,
Yeah.
and feeling definitely pressure to present yourself in a certain way, right? As a Black female writer, I feel like I'm expected to talk about certain things, and I'm expected to be using certain forms, and be experimental in certain ways, um,
Mm,
and I I always try and become more and more comfortable with rejecting sort of that, not because, I want to be contrary, but because I need to allow the space to think in ways that I almost feel like I shouldn't, right? Like, you shouldn't say that. That's not for you to say, because this is not your experience, right? Or that's not for you. You should be focusing on something that's important, right? That's potent.
right. It's like being the perfect marginalized person.
Exactly. And and another thing is that, like, especially, as someone who, I mean, I went to like a grammar school, and I think I present very differently than my work, so people sort of like,
Mm,
they see me and they're like, oh, okay. And then, they see Dickless and they're like, oh, okay, that's a lot more that's a lot more swearing than we had thought. That's a very raunchy. And I'm like, yeah, that's
that's the point.
both me. I think that's a thing that to me still feels like the luxury afforded to sort of, I think, European white men generally, but like they are allowed to be the full breadth of their person, and there's no question about it. And I think for other marginalized groups, there's the challenge is being able to express yourself fully in that way. First, because you have to figure out what is that, because you don't have the language initially to articulate that. And that's why I think so many writers and stuff have had to go abroad and really just go through transformative experiences.
Yeah, yeah.
And then once you develop a language, being confident enough and having enough opportunities to sort of say, here's my new language, here's the way I like to present myself, let me do that and let that be acceptable.
Thank you so much for saying that, because I think that's both like a personal journey
Hmm.
and a collective community
Hmm.
one, right?
Yeah.
I have been fortunate, and I know you have to be in communities where we get to where our identity does not have to be displaced. It
Hmm.
does not, it can be, it's just normal. And those were wonderful opportunities. But truthfully, there can still be like kind of monolithic thinking wherever you are,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
No matter who you're with. So there's always a moment where I have to go back to like, who am I and what am I on this earth to do, right?
Yeah.
And also here all these identities and multiple things are true, and I'm an immigrant,
Hmm.
right? So it's just like navigating this space is never endingly adventurous, I guess I will
Yes.
say.
Yes.
At the same time, it's just like there's always more, like we can always do more to create spaces for artists, so that you never know what the next project could come out of. It was,
Exactly.
I recently spoke to Ins Choi, who created Kim's Convenience. I
Mm.
didn't know that it came out of a play
Yeah.
that he worked on after graduating from theater school at Asian Canadian Theater Company.
Hmm.
He got tired of having no opportunities, no roles, that he finally wrote his own material. And I was out of like community theater spaces.
Yeah.
You know, you just never know.
It's so funny because I have found, even when I was at NYU, I would write characters, and one of the notes that I would get back would be like, I don't know what the ethnic background of this character is. As a note, I knew instinctively, I was like, this is not a useful note. But I realized in hindsight, because for some reason, and I not for some reason, I think we're socialized to think that, like, on the inside I must just be inherently different, as a Black woman, as an Asian woman, as a, you know what I mean, like it must just be inherently different on the inside. It couldn't possibly be this kind of like any person.
Yes,
Yeah.
the being othered is coming from you, not your
Exactly.
environment. And
Yeah, it's
yeah.
like this is too relatable. Where is she from? And sort of be like, is she Nigerian? I'm like, absolutely not. Like, I'm not Nigerian. Like, what? This makes no sense. You know.
Right, right, right.
And so that, I think, I find hilarious. It's a little melancholy, a little sad, but also I think I get a lot of hope from that, because that's what I aim to do. I aim to create stories and characters that feel like they are, entirely universal. You can see
Yeah.
yourself in there. Because if I can do that, then I feel like that's sort of proof that I am also part of the society. I understand it
Right.
as well as you
Right.
do. We're both in the same place. So that's the goal. I think, if anything, that's the big challenge as well. When you're coming from a background that is sort of frequently othered, it's kind of like you have to keep claiming a stake in the society. Like, I'm here, I belong here. In fact, I get it just as much as
Yeah.
you. We're both together. We're doing the same thing.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting one, and maybe I don't know if you ever get to that place, but I do think that being able to create works of all genres, of all types, being able to make bad work, I think that's the real, I one thing I think.
It's such a
Yeah.
privilege.
Oh,
And I
yes.
keep telling people, like, everyone, please I don't know, set a goal to make bad art,
Yes.
if anything, because people do this all the time and
Mhm.
they fail upwards.
Yes. Yes. Fail upwards constantly. And I look at and I'm like, that was objectively just terrible. That was a bad they did not achieve the goal. And yet,
Yeah.
here they are.
The difference may just have been they just decided, who cares?
Yes.
I'm hot shit or
Yeah.
whatever,
The
right?
audacity of it. Yeah.
The audacity,
Yeah. And
yes.
you know what? Why not? Let's all be audacious like this, not sort of hold ourselves back because we sort of think this is not good enough yet. No one is going
Right.
to, I think that's what I see often in sort of like marginalized communities. It's not so much that every opportunity, there's a door closing in your face. I think often we close the doors ourselves because we're kind of like, I'm not ready for the big leagues like that. I haven't had, and they won't understand it. Yeah, it has to be
Yeah.
perfect. It has to be marketable. It has to be, yeah, I get it, but I want to see the scrappy, messy stuff,
Yeah.
because that's where you really get to the heart of like, culture, conversations,
Yeah.
uncomfortableness.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I don't know if that
There's
quite answers, what the experience. I mean, there's all the usual, people.
No, thank you for being willing to tackle this question that
Mhm.
I know is just like a perennial. Hopefully we can continue to be willing to connect with
Yeah.
each other's personal truths. You
Yes.
know what I mean? Because we know multiple things are true, and your perspective is just as valuable as anyone else's, right?
Mhm.
So thank you for your time today and your openness and willingness to chat about these things.
Thank
Some of
you.
them sometimes are like sensitive topics, but I think this is just stuff that we live with,
Mhm.
right? So for anyone who wants to connect with you and check out your work and
Mhm.
maybe work with you, I'll put the links in the show notes.
Mhm.
But for listeners, where can they find you?
The best place to find me is my website. So it's just aishajosiah.com. And I'm woefully bad at keeping it up to date, but it will be getting an update very soon. And so that is where you can sort of, see what I'm up to and things I've done in the past. And then on my socials, again, just my name, Aisha Josiah. I've got my link tree, which has got all of the things that I do with Fringebiscuit and stage analytics, and just my whole jack of all trades sort of goes on there. I am one of those people who social media is a tool for
Yeah.
me, not a pleasurable experience in and of itself.
It's no longer a place where I express myself. No,
Exactly,
it's just
exactly.
I use it for very specific
Yes,
purposes.
but I'm very much a person who loves receiving emails and stuff from people. Like I
Yeah.
think if we still wrote letters, I would enjoy a letter from a stranger. And so that's kind of where I get my joy and stuff. Like people just like, hey, I like read this, and like my email is very open to people, which may or may not bite me in the ass at some point.
I love that. I love that. We'll
Yeah.
have people like find it and like really
Yes.
take you
Yeah.
in
So
and then connect with
yeah,
you,
if you go on my website, you can send me an email directly, and I will read it. And
Yeah.
it'll be a lot more fun than any of the spam ones that I get. trying to extend bicycles or something.
Yeah,
Yeah,
exactly.
but I think that's kind of I'd like that to remain the case, for as long as I've got the bandwidth and stuff for it, because I think especially for artists, we should always feel like we can just knock on each other's doors and just say, hey, I
Yeah.
have no
Never
other,
hurts to reach out.
yeah,
Yeah.
no
Kind
other
of how this
reason, but
happened.
like I saw something you did and I thought it was cool. Just wanted to say hi. I also do cool
Yeah.
things, and I'm like, oh,
Yeah.
great, thank you.
Exactly.
So things like this as well. I love listening to a good podcast and just like finding out about people that I've like snooped on from afar.
Yeah. That's my secret goal, is like I have a stronger case for reaching out to people and to like actually ask them questions I've been wanting to ask.
Exactly.
But like, so once again, thank you so much for being willing for that. And also like, we definitely should keep in touch, you and I. So
Thank you for having me.
hopefully, yeah, this definitely won't be our last convo for sure. So thank you.
Oh, it's been a joy.